Some tourists don't just pack suitcases, they pack impossible expectations, spectacular entitlement, and enough confidence to complain about reality itself. These are the complaints that made hotel managers, tour guides, and entire countries question humanity. 1. A tourist visiting Iceland filed a complaint because the northern lights didn't appear on schedule. They had booked the trip months in advance and assumed the lights worked like a nightly fireworks show. When their guide explained that the aurora depends on solar activity and weather, the visitor insisted the tour company should have turned them on somehow. Apparently, nature now comes with customer service. Somewhere in the Arctic, the Sun was expected to answer an email marked urgent. 2. A visitor in Venice complained that there were too many canals, making it difficult to walk in straight lines. They argued that the city should build more roads because constantly crossing bridges was exhausting. Locals politely explained that Venice has been floating for centuries, but the tourist remained unconvinced. They left a review suggesting the city would be much more practical if someone simply filled in most of the water. Imagine looking at one of the world's most famous cities and deciding it needed a parking lot. 3. One traveler returned from an African safari furious because the lions spent most of the afternoon sleeping. They expected non-stop action after watching dozens of wildlife documentaries. The complaint claimed the animals were lazy and should be encouraged to interact with guests more often. The guide gently explained that lions sleep around 20 hours a day. The tourist suggested feeding them coffee before tours. Nothing says respect for wildlife like wanting caffeine-fueled predators roaming around your Jeep. 4. A tourist visiting the Grand Canyon complained that it was too big to appreciate properly. They said walking to different viewpoints took too much effort and recommended installing moving sidewalks across the rim. The visitor also suggested adding more shade because the canyon was unnecessarily sunny. That's the beauty of tourism. Some people stand before one of Earth's greatest natural wonders and immediately start redesigning it like a shopping mall. 5. During a trip to Switzerland, a traveler complained that the cowbells ringing across mountain villages interrupted their peaceful vacation. They asked whether local farmers could silence the cows overnight. Residents explained the bells help locate grazing cattle across the Alps. The tourist replied that GPS had already been invented. Somewhere, a Swiss cow unknowingly became the latest victim of modern technology, replacing centuries of tradition. 6. A beachgoer in Australia demanded compensation because the ocean contained too much salt. According to the complaint, swimming became uncomfortable after getting seawater in their eyes and mouth. They suggested local authorities dilute the water near tourist beaches for a better customer experience. Lifeguards somehow resisted asking whether they also wanted the sharks switched off while they were making improvements. 7. One visitor touring Egypt was disappointed that the pyramids looked older than expected. They had imagined cleaner stone and brighter colors after seeing edited travel photos online. The complaint claimed the famous monuments could benefit from restoration using modern materials. After surviving more than 4,000 years of history, deserts, and empires, the pyramids were apparently failing because they didn't look freshly renovated enough for social media. 8. A tourist exploring Scotland complained that there was too much history to remember during guided tours. Castles, battles, kings, and legends became overwhelming after the third stop. They suggested removing less important historical events from future presentations to make the country easier to understand. Scotland somehow received feedback asking it to simplify nearly 2,000 years of history into something that could fit between lunch and souvenir shopping. 9. A traveler visiting Japan submitted a complaint because Mount Fuji was partially hidden by clouds. They argued that such an important landmark should always be visible, especially considering how much they paid for the trip. When their guide explained that nobody controls the weather, the tourist suggested installing live cameras on clear days and projecting the image onto the mountain whenever clouds appeared. Apparently, reality should come with a backup display for disappointed vacationers. 10. A visitor to the Maldives complained that the sand was too white because it reflected too much sunlight. According to the review, the beach was so bright it made taking selfies difficult without squinting. Instead of bringing sunglasses, the tourist recommended importing darker sand to improve the experience. Imagine flying halfway across the world to one of the planet's most famous beaches, only to criticize it for looking exactly like the postcards. 11. A tourist in Canada filed a complaint after seeing wild bears from a safe distance instead of up close. They claimed the tour advertised wildlife, but failed to deliver an interactive experience. When the guide explained that keeping bears far away was actually the goal, the guest argued that the animals should be trained to approach visitors for photos. Because nothing improves vacation memories quite like introducing grizzly bears to customer service standards. 12. One traveler visiting the Netherlands complained that there were too many bicycles everywhere. They said cyclists kept appearing from every direction and expected pedestrians to pay attention. The visitor suggested limiting bicycles during tourist season so walking would be easier. Locals found the idea hilarious. Visiting Amsterdam and complaining about bicycles is like visiting Hollywood and asking people to stop making movies because the traffic is inconvenient. 13. A tourist exploring the Amazon rainforest left an angry review because there were too many insects. They admitted expecting some bugs, but felt mosquitoes, butterflies, ants, and beetles were excessive. The complaint suggested regular pesticide spraying throughout the jungle to create a more pleasant visitor experience. It's always impressive when someone enters one of the most biodiverse places on Earth and immediately starts brainstorming ways to remove the biodiversity. 14. A visitor to the Eiffel Tower complained that Paris had too many French people. They expected a more international atmosphere and felt locals speaking French made ordering food unnecessarily difficult. The review recommended hiring more English-speaking staff throughout the city. Paris has survived revolutions, wars, and centuries of history, but apparently its biggest flaw is stubbornly remaining in France. 15. A traveler on a whale-watching cruise demanded a partial refund because the whales surfaced too briefly for perfect photos. They believed the crew should have found friendlier whales willing to stay above water longer. When told these were wild animals following natural behavior, the tourist suggested using food to keep them nearby until everyone finished taking pictures. Somewhere beneath the waves, a humpback whale unknowingly failed its performance review. 16. A tourist visiting the Sahara Desert complained that there was far too much sand. The review explained that sand kept getting into shoes, clothes, cameras, and bags, making the trip uncomfortable. They suggested creating paved walking paths across the dunes and adding more trees for shade. Standing in the world's largest hot desert, they somehow concluded the real problem wasn't the heat, it was the desert itself refusing to be something else. 17. A tourist in Norway complained that the midnight sun made it impossible to tell when it was bedtime. They argued the local tourism board should have warned visitors that the sun might still be shining at 11 o'clock at night. Even after receiving blackout curtains, the guest insisted someone should dim the sky during sleeping hours. Nature was apparently expected to follow hotel quiet hours. The Arctic Circle has many unusual features, but according to this traveler, its biggest flaw was refusing to respect a normal bedtime. 18. A visitor in Ireland complained that it rained during their vacation despite seeing several sunny travel brochures. They claimed the advertisements created unrealistic expectations and suggested the country should only promote itself during dry weather. When locals joked that unpredictable rain is practically Ireland's national mascot, the tourist didn't laugh. Somehow, an island famous for green landscapes was expected to achieve that without occasional rainfall. That's like ordering ice cream and complaining it arrived cold. 19. A tourist exploring the Great Wall of China left a review saying there were far too many stairs. They expected a pleasant historical walk, but found themselves constantly climbing uphill. The complaint suggested installing escalators across the steepest sections to make the attraction accessible without getting tired. The wall defended an empire for centuries, yet someone decided its greatest weakness was lacking modern shopping mall infrastructure. 20. One visitor to Finland complained that locals were too quiet. They expected strangers to greet them everywhere they went, but instead encountered people peacefully minding their own business. The traveler described this as unfriendly behavior and suggested hospitality training for the general population. Locals probably considered the silence a perfect day. In Finland, respecting someone's personal space isn't rude. Interrupting it usually is. 21. A tourist visiting Iceland became frustrated because several waterfalls looked too similar. After seeing multiple cascades in one day, they complained the country should create more variety between them. Some could be taller, others wider, perhaps even different colors. Apparently, Mother Nature was expected to diversify her product line to avoid repetitive sightseeing. Somewhere, millions of years of geology received a one-star performance review for lacking creativity. 22. A traveler in Mexico complained that tacos purchased from street vendors tasted too authentic. They expected flavors closer to what they usually ate back home and felt local recipes were unfamiliar. The review suggested vendors should offer more traditional versions for international tourists. It's always fascinating when someone travels thousands of miles specifically to experience another culture, then becomes disappointed because they experienced another culture. 23. A tourist visiting New Zealand complained that sheep were visible almost everywhere. They said the countryside contained too many farms, making drives feel repetitive. The visitor even wondered whether the government could relocate some sheep to less populated regions. Considering the country has millions more sheep than people, that request would have required one of the greatest livestock relocation projects in history, all to improve somebody's road trip scenery. 24. A visitor to the Arctic complained that polar bears were too difficult to find. They believed such famous animals should appear more regularly during guided tours and questioned whether the guides were searching hard enough. After being told polar bears roam enormous territories and avoid humans whenever possible, the tourist suggested building designated viewing areas where bears could report at certain times each day, because apparently even the world's largest land predator should work regular office hours for paying customers. 25. A tourist in Dubai complained that the desert safari contained too much actual desert. They expected more cafes, shaded rest areas, and Wi-Fi along the dunes. After 40 minutes of driving through endless sand, they asked the guide when they would finally reach the interesting part. The guide politely explained that the desert itself was the attraction. The guest later suggested building a few shopping centers between the dunes to make the landscape feel less empty. Apparently, even one of Earth's oldest deserts should come with a food court. 26. A visitor in Greece filed a complaint because the ancient ruins looked too ruined. They expected temples with complete roofs, polished columns, and freshly painted walls instead of weathered stone. After learning that many structures were over 2,000 years old, the tourist asked why the government hadn't simply rebuilt them. History, it seems, should occasionally receive a fresh coat of paint if it wants better online reviews. 27. A traveler visiting Brazil's Amazon River complained that the water looked too brown. Expecting crystal-clear tropical water like the Caribbean, they assumed the river was polluted. Their guide explained that the color comes from natural sediment carried through the rainforest. The visitor remained skeptical, suggesting authorities invest in better filtration. Somehow, the world's largest river system was expected to resemble a luxury swimming pool. 28. One tourist in Germany complained that too many castles were located on hills. After climbing several steep paths, they questioned why medieval builders hadn't chosen flatter, easier locations. The guide explained that castles were designed for defense, not convenience. The traveler responded that elevators would solve the problem today. Medieval kings spent fortunes protecting their kingdoms, but apparently should have prioritized wheelchair access for tourists arriving 8 centuries later. 29. A visitor in Thailand complained that elephants looked smaller than in the movies. They admitted expecting gigantic animals after watching adventure films and were disappointed by reality. Even after learning that Asian elephants are naturally smaller than African elephants, the tourist insisted the park's elephants seemed underwhelming. Hollywood special effects had somehow raised impossible expectations for animals that already weigh several tons. 30. A tourist touring Scotland's Loch Ness complained because Nessie failed to appear during the boat trip. They admitted knowing the monster probably wasn't real, but argued the tour should provide something believable for paying guests. When the captain laughed, the visitor suggested using an animatronic creature at scheduled times each afternoon. Imagine inventing a legendary mystery, then getting a 1-star review because the fictional character skipped work that day. 31. A traveler visiting the Galapagos Islands complained that the giant tortoises walked far too slowly. They expected more active wildlife photography opportunities, but spent most of the excursion watching tortoises move a few feet every several minutes. The review suggested encouraging the animals to exercise more often. After evolving for millions of years, surviving volcanic islands, and becoming symbols of patience, the tortoises were criticized for behaving exactly like tortoises. 32. A tourist in Austria complained that classical musicians kept performing Mozart. They felt every concert, souvenir shop, and guided tour mentioned him too often and suggested giving other composers a chance. Locals politely pointed out that Salzburg is Mozart's birthplace. Complaining about Mozart there is like visiting Memphis and wondering why people keep bringing up Elvis. Sometimes a city's biggest celebrity isn't going anywhere. 33. A visitor exploring Yellowstone National Park complained that the geysers erupted too unpredictably. Waiting 45 minutes for Old Faithful felt unreasonable, and the tourist believed the park should operate the geysers on stricter schedules. Rangers explained that geothermal activity doesn't follow customer reservations. The guest suggested using hidden machinery to guarantee perfectly timed eruptions every 15 minutes. Nothing says protecting nature, quite like asking volcanoes to start working office shifts. 34. A tourist visiting Antarctica complained that there were not enough penguins in one place. They expected enormous crowds of birds surrounding every landing site and felt disappointed when wildlife remained scattered across the landscape. Expedition staff explained that penguins naturally nest in different colonies depending on the season. The traveler suggested creating one giant penguin area so visitors wouldn't have to search for them. Apparently, even wild animals should reorganize their entire population for better sightseeing efficiency. 35. A tourist vacationing in the Caribbean complained that the palm trees blocked their ocean view. Instead of moving to another lounge chair, they suggested the resort trim or remove several mature trees because they got in the way of the scenery. Staff explained the palms were part of the scenery. The guest remained unconvinced, insisting the beach would look much nicer with fewer tropical plants. It's an impressive achievement to visit paradise and conclude the biggest problem is that it looks too much like paradise. 36. A visitor in India complained that local markets were too crowded with local people. They expected colorful streets and authentic culture, but without so many residents shopping at the same time. The review suggested creating separate visiting hours exclusively for tourists. Apparently, thousands of people should pause their daily lives, so vacation photos can contain fewer inconvenient humans. Nothing captures the spirit of cultural appreciation quite like asking the culture to step aside. 37. A tourist in Alaska complained that glaciers were too cold to enjoy. They admitted touching the ice for a photo, but found it surprisingly freezing. The visitor wondered whether climate-controlled viewing areas could make the experience more comfortable. Their guide politely explained that glaciers are, by definition, giant masses of ice. It takes remarkable confidence to discover frozen water is cold and immediately blame the destination instead of basic physics. 38. A traveler visiting Rome complained that too many famous landmarks were concentrated in one city. After walking between the Colosseum, the Forum, and the Pantheon, they felt overwhelmed by the number of historic sites packed into a single day. The review suggested spreading some monuments across other Italian cities for better balance. 2,000 years of civilization apparently needed a better urban planning consultant. 39. A tourist at Niagara Falls complained that the waterfall created too much mist. Every time they approached the viewing platform, their clothes and camera lens became damp. They questioned why park officials hadn't installed barriers to stop the spray from reaching visitors. Staff explained that millions of gallons of water falling every minute naturally create mist. The guest seemed disappointed that one of the world's largest waterfalls insisted on behaving like a waterfall. 40. A visitor exploring Iceland's famous geothermal areas complained about the strong smell of sulfur. They claimed the odor ruined otherwise beautiful scenery and suggested adding scented air fresheners around the hot springs. The guide explained that the smell came from naturally occurring volcanic gases. The tourist replied that lavender would probably improve the experience. After millions of years creating one of Earth's most unique landscapes, volcanoes apparently failed the fragrance test. 41. A tourist on safari in Kenya complained that zebras were basically striped horses. They expected a more exotic animal after hearing so much about them. Even after watching entire herds crossing the savannah, the visitor concluded the animals were overrated because they looked too familiar. It's hard to impress someone who travels across the globe only to criticize evolution for not being more creative with horse design. 42. A traveler visiting the Swiss Alps complained that the mountains made driving take too long. Instead of winding roads and scenic passes, they expected direct highways through the region. The review suggested digging more tunnels so tourists wouldn't have to spend time looking at mountains. Most visitors travel there specifically for the mountain views. This one wanted the Alps politely moved underground for convenience. 43. A tourist in Paris complained that too many cafes had outdoor seating. They felt uncomfortable walking past so many people drinking coffee and watching pedestrians. The guest suggested encouraging restaurants to move customers indoors to create quieter sidewalks. Locals probably found that suggestion as strange as asking Venice to get rid of boats. Sometimes the very thing that makes a city famous becomes someone's biggest inconvenience. 44. A visitor to Hawaii complained that sunsets happened too early during their vacation. They expected longer evenings for beach photos and blamed the island for not matching the daylight hours back home. After learning that sunset times change throughout the year, they suggested tourism officials publish a better schedule, or possibly adjust local time during peak vacation season. Somewhere, the Earth was expected to slow its rotation because one traveler wanted another 20 minutes for Instagram. 45. A tourist visiting Iceland complained that there were too many waterfalls. After stopping at several famous cascades in a single day, they claimed each one started to look the same and suggested replacing a few with different attractions. Their guide pointed out that Iceland's dramatic landscape is shaped by glaciers, volcanoes, and countless rivers. The guest replied that one or two waterfalls would have been enough. It's difficult to impress someone who can look at nature's greatest highlights and ask for more parking lots instead. 46. A visitor to Machu Picchu complained that the ancient city sat too high up. The climb left them exhausted, and they questioned why the Incas hadn't chosen a more accessible location. Even after learning the mountaintop offered strategic protection and breathtaking views, the tourist suggested a moving walkway directly to the entrance. The Inca Empire managed incredible engineering without modern machinery, yet someone still expected them to have installed escalators for future vacation packages. 47. A tourist in Thailand complained because monkeys kept trying to steal snacks from visitors. They insisted the animals should be trained to behave politely around humans. Park staff explained that wild monkeys naturally associate food with tourists after decades of handouts. The guest remained frustrated, arguing that warning signs weren't enough and the monkeys needed better manners. Apparently, wildlife should attend customer service seminars before interacting with paying guests. 48. A visitor in New York City complained that Times Square was far too crowded. They had expected one of the world's busiest intersections to be lively, but not with quite so many people. The review suggested introducing daily visitor limits so tourists could enjoy the giant billboards without other tourists getting in the way. It's one of travel's greatest ironies. Thousands of people travel to famous places, then complain that everyone else had exactly the same idea. 49. A traveler in Iceland complained that volcanic rocks were too sharp to sit on. While exploring a lava field, they expected comfortable places to rest and questioned why the area hadn't been landscaped for visitors. Their guide explained that the rocks were formed by volcanic eruptions thousands of years ago. The tourists suggested smoothing the rough edges with machinery. Few things are more ambitious than trying to redesign geology because your picnic was uncomfortable. 50. A tourist visiting the Australian outback complained that there were too many empty spaces between attractions. Long drives through open landscapes felt boring, and they suggested building more towns along the highways. Locals smiled and explained that's exactly what makes the outback unique. The visitor still felt several hundred miles of wilderness could probably use a few coffee shops and gas stations. Sometimes people mistake untouched nature for poor urban planning. 51. A traveler exploring the Scottish Highlands complained that the scenery looked too much like the postcards. They expected hidden surprises, but instead found mountains, lakes, and castles exactly as advertised. Somehow, reality matching the brochure became a disappointment. The review implied tourism photos had spoiled the experience by being too accurate. That's a rare complaint. Most destinations struggle because the pictures promise too much, not because they accidentally tell the truth. 52. A tourist in Costa Rica complained that tropical birds began singing far too early in the morning. The colorful wildlife that attracted visitors during the day became an annoyance before sunrise. They suggested local hotels discourage birds from gathering near guest rooms. Staff politely explained they had very little influence over parrots and toucans. Nature apparently failed to respect the breakfast schedule of someone sleeping with the windows open. 53. A visitor to the Sahara Desert complained that nighttime temperatures became unexpectedly cold. They assumed deserts stayed hot 24 hours a day and packed only lightweight clothing. After learning that deserts often cool dramatically after sunset, the traveler suggested tour companies install outdoor heaters around camping areas. It was a bold attempt to solve one of Earth's oldest climate patterns with a few patio warmers. 54. A tourist visiting the Swiss Alps complained that the air was too fresh. After several days in the mountains, they said the crisp, clean air felt unusual compared to the city they came from, and jokingly admitted they missed the familiar smell of traffic. The review suggested mountain villages could use a little more civilization. Few destinations could ever receive a stranger criticism than being guilty of having air that was simply too clean to feel normal. 55. A tourist visiting the Galapagos Islands complained that the giant tortoises refused to pose for photos. Every time they approached with a camera, the animals slowly turned away or pulled their heads into their shells. The visitor suggested the park employ handlers to encourage the tortoises to face guests during peak visiting hours. Rangers explained that the animals had absolutely no interest in becoming influencers. Apparently, evolution's greatest survival strategy now included disappointing Instagram photographers. 56. A traveler in Venice complained that riding in a gondola was too slow. They expected a quicker way to explore the canals and wondered why nobody had introduced speedboats for sightseeing. The gondolier smiled and explained that the peaceful pace was exactly the point. The guest later described the experience as beautiful but inefficient. It's hard to enjoy a city built 8 centuries ago when you're mentally racing to your next calendar notification. 57. A visitor touring the Norwegian fjords complained that the cliffs were too dramatic. Looking over the edge made them uncomfortable, and they felt the scenery was almost intimidating. The review suggested installing more guardrails and reducing access to the highest viewpoints. Millions of years of glacial carving created one of the world's greatest landscapes, only for someone to conclude it needed softer edges and less ambition. 58. A tourist in Morocco complained that local markets expected customers to negotiate prices. They preferred fixed prices and found bargaining stressful, suggesting vendors simply display one final price for everyone. Merchants politely explained that negotiating had been part of local culture for generations. The traveler left frustrated after discovering the market wasn't malfunctioning. It was functioning exactly as intended. Sometimes culture feels confusing only because it isn't designed around your habits. 59. A visitor in the Canadian Rockies complained that the mountains blocked their cell phone signal. They argued that such a popular tourist destination should provide perfect reception everywhere, especially on remote hiking trails. Park staff explained that preserving vast wilderness sometimes meant sacrificing convenience. The tourist suggested installing additional towers on mountain peaks. Nature had survived untouched for thousands of years, but apparently the real emergency was a buffering video. 60. A traveler visiting Kyoto during cherry blossom season complained there were too many people looking at trees. They expected peaceful gardens, but instead found thousands of visitors enjoying the blooms. The review questioned why everyone seemed so excited about flowers that would disappear in a few weeks. That's the entire point, of course. The beauty is temporary. Unfortunately, patience isn't always included in the price of a plane ticket. 61. A tourist in Iceland complained that the geothermal Blue Lagoon smelled too much like eggs. After paying for a luxury spa experience, they weren't expecting sulfur-rich steam rising from volcanic water. Staff explained the minerals were completely natural and part of the attraction. The guest suggested adding scented oils to mask the smell. Apparently, thousands of years of volcanic activity should be redesigned to resemble a luxury candle store. 62. A visitor to the Amazon complained that the rainforest was too green.
After several days surrounded by dense vegetation, they felt the scenery lacked variety and wished there were more open spaces. Their guide looked around at the largest tropical rainforest on Earth and politely explained that forests generally contain trees. It was probably the only place on the planet where someone could become bored by having too much nature. 63. A traveler in Austria complained that church bells rang too often throughout the day. They appreciated the historic villages, but believed the bells interrupted their afternoon naps. The review suggested replacing them with quieter electronic notifications. Local residents had listened to those bells for generations. Meanwhile, one vacation was apparently enough to launch a modernization campaign against centuries of tradition. 64. A tourist visiting Yellowstone complained that bison caused traffic jams by walking across the roads.
They argued park rangers should train the animals to cross only at designated areas or install fencing to keep them moving. Rangers explained that the roads pass through the bison's habitat, not the other way around. It's always amusing when people drive into a national park and immediately expect wildlife to obey traffic laws. 65. A visitor in Iceland complained that the country's names were too difficult to pronounce. They struggled with place names ending in fjall and jökull and suggested adding simpler English alternatives to every road sign. Locals politely helped with pronunciation, but the tourist insisted the language itself seemed unnecessarily complicated. Imagine arriving in another country and deciding the alphabet should be updated for your convenience. 66. A tourist cruising through Alaska complained that icebergs floated too far away from the ship. They expected dramatic close-up views, but were disappointed by the captain's cautious distance. After learning that large chunks of ice can suddenly break apart without warning, the visitor suggested getting just a little closer. The Titanic would probably have had a few thoughts about that customer recommendation. 67. A traveler visiting the Dead Sea complained that the water was too floaty. They expected a relaxing swim, but found it difficult to dive underwater because of the lake's extreme salt content. The review questioned why nobody had adjusted the salt levels to make swimming feel more normal. Think about that for a second. They traveled halfway around the world to experience one of the most unique bodies of water on Earth, then complained because it behaved exactly the way it's famous for behaving. Sometimes the greatest tourist attraction isn't the destination, it's the person reviewing it afterward. So, which complaint deserves the World Championship of Entitlement? Tell me in the comments, and if humanity still has a few surprises left, don't worry, we'll be back to laugh at them together.